Hello, everybody. My name is Aztec Sovereign, your host for today on the Tell Your Story podcast. Today, we're going to be diving in some topics of old history of the Nisqually tribe and so on, leading up to the fish wars and where we are today now. And I'm here with a special guest. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Aztec. Hanford McCloud, Nisqually Tribal member.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and
Sure.
your history with the Nisqually tribe?
Well, I'd start, with my parents. So my parents is Joyce and Don McCloud Jr. My grandparents are Janet and Don McCloud Sr. Great grandparents on the paternal side, and then would be, Angeline Tobin and Andrew McCloud Sr. Grew up on the reservation and grew up in the town of Yelm all my life. That's kind of my story of where I've been. Not far from the river or from the mountain or from the prairie here, where I grew up.
And then tell us a little bit about um, your family's history with fishing.
With the fishing and the activism that went on in the '60s, my experience that I like to share with is the story of my grandmother Janet and Don McLeod Sr. and that will to stand up for our right. If it was for just being Native American, but it always goes back to that fishing because that what I saw was our treaty right that we fought for. That uh, when I say we, I talk about Lushai and prior to where we are today, and so. Yelm in the '80s and '90s was no different from when it was probably in the early 1800s to the late 1900s. Where the families that I grew up with in Yelm were descendants of those that Lushai and I would say our warriors took care of here in the prairie of Yelm. In Yelm means ancestor. Yelm means ancestor in our language. That's how connected that area of that prairie to the river is for our people.
Okay,
Let me
nice.
let me dive in a little bit deeper into that too, Aztec, when I talk about um, the activism that my grandmother and grandfather were a big part of. It's a story that when I hear from my father, Don McLeod Jr., and hear of the, I would say, terror that went on the banks of the river along Frank's Landing and other areas along the Nisqually. That when you think about Nisqually, Squalliops means people of the river, but also means people of the prairie. So that experience would be then just having to stand up for what is right or who we are. It was a point too where we always had to explain and show that we lived here, that we fished here, that we're Native Americans, and that we belong here. In some aspect, and it grew for us on the Native American side. It grew because we were placed on the reservation. Not by our choice, but by that negotiation, which they say is a treaty. But really, when you think about it, we were placed in areas so that they could be comfortable, and then our people were taken out of our comfortableism and placed in a place that was not comfortable for us. And what I'd say between what my grandmother taught us, because then it was that we need to be the voice. You need to say something because nobody's going to say this for you, right? And nobody's going to speak on our behalf, especially when it comes to Native Americans, treaties, rights, all that pertain to us. Free medical, dental. They act like these things were stuff that we asked for. Oh yeah, give it to us for free. No, 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 no. That's not how that worked. Again, given to us, because they took everything else away from us. And when my grandma would teach us that or talk about it more than anything, like today, the conversation is, she would always talk to us about this, how important it is, you know, um, gardening, food, and practicing or exercising. That is what we call a treaty right, and that's because that's what I would say needed to happen more so when they say, well, you have this right, but we don't exercise it. And um, seeing that in my young childhood, my first experience would be activism on Yelm, Crystal Springs Road, Edward Street, named after the family in that area turned into Crystal Springs. So uh, they were widening the road, and my grandma bought 10 acres off of Crystal Springs down about middle stream of this road, and it goes all the way down to the end of Canal Road in Yelm, along Yelm Creek. Trying to paint a picture for everybody to see that, right? And what happened was they were going to put the sidewalk, and they were expanding both sides, and they would then, just confiscate that. What'd you say, 6 feet to 10 feet of easement for the sidewalk. And my grandma said, "No, you're not cutting these trees down. These trees were pretty old, actually. They were probably planted by the settler family my grandma bought it from. She bought it in 1954 or 55. And so it was a prairie home sitting there along that creek bed of Yelm Creek. And prior to them cutting it down, I always say she was either one watching us and babysitting us, because then my mom and dad had to go to work, and we were staying there with grandma throughout the day. And then they'd come pick us up after work, 4 o'clock or so. So now you see these surveyors coming down and marking trees as they were walking down the street. So my grandma knew that this was happening, got us all together and brought us out and put us in what we'd call a red headband, and tied a red bandana around our right arm, and then placed us around the trees. And here you are, 8 to 10-year-old standing there, like, what are we doing? But now at this point, we were backing away from the trees, and then my grandma proceeded to wrap a rope around your wrist and latch you together like a chain link around this tree. First experience ever, I always say, and I'm reminded of that because now you think about trauma, but you also think about the happiness, and that's what I think about. What my grandma and I went through with the trauma and the fish wars, to then going through it and making sure that it doesn't happen no more to her grandkids. And I think that was her goal, especially in the Yelm setting, in that 10 acres or 15 acres in that area that my grandpa bought, and then his brother bought, Andrew McCloud, outside of Yelm.
And so, what were the surveyors trying to do? Were they trying to get rid of the trees, or?
Yeah.
And then I was gonna say as well, for those who don't know about the fish wars, can you explain to them what the fish wars was and when it happened? Give a little information about that.
Fish wars during the time of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And when I read into that, not so much research, because it's like a family history for myself. Um, Billy Frank Jr. was Don McCloud Sr.'s half brother, and coming from a big family, I always say that, because a lot of these villages were of family. That's who we are. Squally, Wells, McCloud, Kalama. You think about these names in this region today. Back then, they were bigger. Villages were plentiful, because of the salmon run. So if you imagine the Nisqually River being the main stem, and the main stem being that the salmon run up the main stem of the river and find these creeks and streams that are important, and important to not only the prairies and the trees, but important to the people. And as a 5-generation fisherman, this maybe even further than that, it's important for our people to be next to the river. And that's what pertained to the allotted land that we got it during the we would say the treaty wars, and then exercising our right to fish is what we stood on. And that's how I seen it. Don, Billy, Al, these individuals, they served in the military also. So being a part of World War II and others, they knew, from what I would say, they knew what was important, because now my grandfather Don seeing the treaty being signed on the deck of the Missouri, and then going, "Hey, we have a treaty at home." Now, when they come home from these wars, right, and this is from the 50s to the 60s, especially the Korean War, World War I, and World War II, all the men in this village who went to war and fought was kind of in their blood, right, to fight for, which is what they're protecting, their family and their livelihood or their homeland. Fish wars to me was because, again, stories of experience is all I can share with the crowd, with the people. And that story to me, to Hanford, would be, it's a it's a heritage of culture, and not saying a right, because when you think about this was already established as that for our people for a long time, and the words are in the treaty as such, to right the right to hunt, fish, and gather in their usual and accustomed territory, and those words had to be exercised during that fish war, and it had to be at a time where I guess people have to go to jail, and a lot of people went to jail for that right to exercise what I'd always say, that culture of ours that we had, and the tradition behind it was, you know, canoes. Yeah, there was some form of net and others that we used to capture our salmon, right, or to herd them into an area that we could capture our salmon. As time goes and rolls forward, you can see how we as native people had to what they would say evolve around what's happening, um, which is, I wouldn't say true, but it's a fact, because either that or you got dominated and got rolled over. And our people, my grandfather, my uncles, aunties, grandmother, when you think about them, knew that, because they fought in a war, and then when they came home, they knew that this had to be a fight to show the people that they had to again explain to that this is our right, and this right goes back thousands of years to do this.
And so, what does culture mean in your own eyes?
Culture is a heritage of that we would say, tradition would be canoes, paddling in our canoes, harvesting our salmon, going into the prairies, and doing this. But it's also the fact that when I think of cultures, I think of how how we were put in charge of this area, and it would go back to um, um, Nisqually being the center of the universe. And I would say the center of the universe because uh, when the when the glaciers melted in this area, it opened up a hole here around this valley, and around this valley became a story that we call Takolma. Don't forget the water. And when you hear these stories, these aren't stories; these are tellings. This is how it happened, right? And you can hear these when the scientific people come in and tell you about the glaciers melting and the mountains moving and this happening. We believe them, but when you then talk to a native person and give you these stories, we have to be convinced around that. I have to convince you now that this is how it was. This is how it is, and this is who we are, right? And that voice is that culture of heritage, and um, you know, Uncle had that way of saying that, you know, uh, it's the habitat, stupid.
uh, uh, I swear, a lot of growing up, like being on the res or just in general, native family, they're always like pretty blunt with each- when just talking to
Hmm.
youngins. But also, I was gonna say, do you have any stories of when you were just say little kid, going to the river fishing? Any stories of you witnessing anything?
Yeah, my stories, when I think about being like, and they're kind of hard to remember back to the age of 8 and 10 and 12 and 14, but I do have these traumatic events when you think about that too, that are tied to that history point. And uh, mine are on the banks of the Puyallup, on the shores of Chambers Bay out there, and even out in Commencement Bay on the shores of outside of Purdy, in those areas that we used to fish out in the Sound with our beach seine nets and gill nets and set nets that we would set out there. Um, Mine is a time of place, because our people set the clock by the tide, by the run of the salmon. And when you see these salmon, for, I would say, we'll go back 40 years, and salmon ran up the rivers, right at the start of July for us. And my school, when we went to school, there was another run that came in, and in the time of where we are today, during the Christmas time, there was another run for our people, and so we always had this what we call potlatch, this giving, because there was so much that came to us that we then turned around and gave it back, because that's what was taught. That's how it was taught, um, to not just consume, but you gotta give back to what was given to you. The offerings that are given to us, we need to also offer that back.
The day
Real
of
man, that's what it
fishing
was.
it.
So my offering story was, uh, especially in the Puyallup River a lot. I grew up with my grandpa, Don McCloud Sr., and then of course my dad, Don McCloud Jr. and and fishing up there in the urban setting, I call it, because again, Puyallup, the city of Tacoma, was built right around the mouth of the river, and for me, it was a two life. I lived down here in Nisqually, but I always went up to Puyallup and fished with my father. My mother's Nisqually, and so um, I always say the first part of my life I was Puyallup. Second part of my life I'm now here in Nisqually living with my mother. Um, and that's how I feel our villages were set, during those times. And this fishing village, I always call it up in Puyallup, is we would catch these huge salmon during the August time, and these king salmon that came up these rivers, Nisqually and Puyallup, were anywhere from 40 to 50 to 60 pounds. Um, and when they'd catch a big one, they'd always lay him right there on this tarp right out in front of the road on the banks of the river. And then us boys, everybody had a son. I always felt on the banks, and then we'd all lay next to that king salmon to see who was bigger. And we were always smaller than that king salmon, unless you were older, over 10. We'd always say 10. Um, but as my time grew on the river, it was alcoholism that was always in place, on these banks of these rivers, because that kept you warm, right, and that kept you going in that setting. Um, what's time? How old was I? I was 15 when my father sobered up. 15. So stories of those is I always had to drive the truck, and I always had to drive the truck and the boat trailer all the time, because you know intoxication was in common for our dads and uncles. So we always had to step up and be older than we should have been at a time. I always say, but that gave me the skills of who I am today. Being able to, drive big rig trailers and things like that, because we experienced that when we were little, and you always had to have somebody back the boat down, because again, you know, as time went on and the tide went in and out, dad and uncles became intoxicated. You had to get the boat out before it floated down the river. And today, because I fast forward to today too, also with these stories, because it shows of a generation of people where they were wanting to slow us down or kill us off, and giving us this stuff did that. And as you sober up from that, you realize more of what's available for us as Native people. So, you know, there's not as much salmon, but what we see is that the importance of it, because again, it's gonna bring us back to not a consuming world, but to a world that takes care of one another. And when these places were like that, that's what Nisqually was, a place to gather and a place they came through to get their water, to get their salmon, to provide, and then to head back to their villages of other areas. Maybe it's in the mountains, maybe it was in the valleys of different prairies that we had in our systems here around Washington. And so my fishing story turns into a diving story, because I went from a fisherman to a diver, um, because we saw that too. My grandpa saw that. Uh, I was 14. I hadn't been around those times of 13, 14. But he bought a big boat to not only one, gill net, but to two, to be able to go out and go do some sort of diving. Because during that U.S. versus Washington in the '80s, it opened up that shellfish game for us also, not just the salmon. And this fight to me today is that it's not just about salmon; it's about all those resources that was important to us, you know, and resources of of salmon, deer, elk, all those up there, but also the resources of our kids of the next generation having access to this, being available to do this on their own without having to, I think, one, show and prove who they are to the people who ask questions that sit in these upper above areas and say, well, I don't know anything, and my argument is always around Washingtonians, and when you move to Washington, you got to be educated about this environment. That's what again, Uncle would tell you. As an environmentalist, you have to know your environment that you're moving into, and those are again of us fishing these rivers, knowing the tides and knowing what floods and what doesn't flood and how it runs that way, especially with the salmon. Salmon are key to that, staple to that, I should say.
And it's fishing in general. Like the Nisqually people are always practicing that, gathering, the fishing. You know, people still to this day, they every year they gear up and go diving, either for geoduck or clams or a
Hmm.
bunch of stuff like that. And then and who can you tell us a little bit about kind of the beginnings of the fish wars and Willie Frank Sr., Billy Frank Jr. Um, get on topics of how they fought for the rights for the Nisqually people, for Native people in the area. Um, how it led up to where everyone is now in terms of having those rights.
That's a great question. I don't ponder, but I always paddle that question. We're canoers, we're paddlers, and you go on these journeys, and you get people to help you go on these journeys, and then you put them in your canoe, and then you paddle them with you. And that journey again is not to get to the end of that finish line; it's to get through this area, and that's what Uncle took people on, a journey. And the ones who wanted to go got in his canoe. Okay, that's kind of how I seen, like, with my grandma too, Janet over here. She went, in these canoes. They had to go. We had to go. We had to do this work. We had to do this work, and we had to do this work because again, it was during a time where they weren't giving us that credit. They weren't giving us that advice. They weren't helping us. They would say, "You are who you are waiting for. Stop asking. Stop looking for this question. We know what we need to do." Part of it was stripped away from us. So when this fight ensued, they'd always say the war will go on and we win certain battles, right? And these battles that were always coming up, there was Uncle Billy, walking into the battle, walking into the office, walking into the doors. Um, and that was by his choice. Nobody decided that. And it was that moved him to do that, and mainly, I think it was his father, Grandpa Billy, and having that tradition of heritage because he spoke the language. He was a part of the allotment and things like that. So when you teach that, and then not only teach it, but you experience that, you're able to I guess tell your story, right? Um, and these stories aren't lies, right? Because a lie is something you have to cover up, make sure you're not telling the truth. So when you tell the truth, it's easier to walk down this path. And I would say, and it's easier to paddle your canoe, right? And um, canoe because the boat's too fast. The boat, you ain't gonna hear nothing. The car goes down the street. You don't even get to see the scenery. You got to get out and walk to see the scenery. So that would be the other portion of that. Walking this land for thousands of years, right? And these families that we come from, that you'd say, well, Governor Stevens had us pinned as hostile Indians, where in actuality we were probably the most peaceful, kindest, openest arms, potlatch people that gave everything away and helped you undauntedly with whatever you needed in a task. And we do that still today, right? Um, and and it was always, I wouldn't say always, but the ones that when the occasion rose, those ones stand up, and then that's taught to the ones behind you, right? So that's why we stood up. That's why Uncle stood up with his brothers. They all stood up. Um, Lost my train of thought.
And then
Question.
how did the fish wars really begin? Like what was the cause of all of it? Um, that really struck the I guess the police to start policing, Nisqually people about fishing on.
Well, not only policing them, but it was more of an attraction. When you see a beautiful 32-pound steelhead come out of the banks of the river, you're just in awe. And that's how these commercial sporties guys were. And we can't kill that fish, right? That salmon or that fish needs to live. And these Indians out here, look at them out here fishing with their nets. What are they doing? And it was the ignorance of not understanding what was happening, right? And then again, two forces coming together and colliding and creating a mess, right? Uh, ours is we have the blueprints and the understandings to take care of these creeks, streams, rivers, and lakes for the salmon, the trout, the flounder, the crab, the shellfish, and but they don't believe us, right? And again, it always comes back to that. Um, Fish Wars was a um, people's own, especially on the state side. My opinion, because again, I wasn't there, but when I hear my father talk about how it was always about commercial sporties that wanted to make sure that the salmon would survive, right? Like again, not knowing that we've been here for 6,522 years, that we've been taking care of the salmon, burning the prairies, fixing the trees, uh, manicuring these spaces around these lakes and streams for the salmon people. Yeah, the canning. Yeah, the fact that this salmon needed to go nationwide, and then the canneries came into place along all the riverheads, and that was one of the main things, around that, and and leaving out the native people though we didn't exist during that time. And then as it became relevant, because again, civil unrest was created right there in the 50s and the 60s. There was a lot of things happening during that time, um, that was questioning a lot of Congress and native and BIA and our rights and our treaties, and you know so fish wars was an exercise of men again. um, and my analogy is the six of Lushai, Quaimuth, the group that stood up and fought Kitsap, the chiefs, the ones that stood up and fought in the treaty wars. It's the same effect here, as they know that this needed to happen, so the six rose up, so the rest could follow, or at least be involved, right? Because ours here was a main stem river that was being questioned, and it was only not only being questioned, but the salmon were being taken as if it was theirs to take. That they owned this portion of the river and they owned this portion of the land. This is ours, right? Where water today is still under question. But so the fish wars was a space to what Hanford saw, and reading into it today, that stood as that foundation, right? Because we built off of that, and the state tries to use those. And to me, it's the language. There's always been the language for us to understand, because the treaty wasn't our negotiation, but the fish wars was ours, that we take place, that we as native people hold up the high standard, because that was our negotiation. We're not being treated fairly. We're not getting the equal, that when you read the treaty and what it states and who we are in this negotiation. So I think it was always to make sure that you uphold what you talk about, you given the people, Congress, Washington, and it does pertain to the treaty, and how that was, how them words were twisted around to better fit the settlers, the community, the government, as it rises up to what it is today. It's under question today. But again, one things my grandma and others that I grew up with would be that they would say that man's law was always made to be broken. Man's law was always written to be unwritten, into their own words. But natural law is natural law. That's what we follow. That's what we know is what needs to be when you think about nature and Mother Earth and natural law. Like with the salmon, they talk about today. Well, there's not enough wild salmon. No, they're natural salmon. These salmon are staple and natural to this region. You were the wild ones that came in here and cut the trees down and diverted water for your own personal use without thinking about the other species in like how we are. That's how native people are connected to that we think about that. Um, so fish wars was in a place and time, I believe, as wars were going off, we needed a war to better understand what was ours because it wasn't being understood at all on both ends. Even still, today with who we are as the Squally people of the river. Um, uh, we got JBLM, Joint Base Lewis McCord, in our backyard. Um, that doesn't really help us. It doesn't really pay mind to us. Anyways, let's ask another question. I don't go down that path.
Yeah, so a lot of protests, a lot of activism was going on during that time, and Billy Frank Jr. was considered the voice of all that. The one who really stepped up to fight alongside with his people who are really fighting for the
Voice in the picture. When you think about kids, and what was happening, we weren't seeing pictures of colored people, of this descendant, of that. It was a different look. So when you started seeing that happening, that's what struck a lot of other non-native, you know, people what was happening around, especially in our area here in the Northwest, and then the Midwest, and then of course in the East Coast and things like that. But here, when you think about who was going to continue that work, there was Billy Frank, one of the few.
And then you know how many times exactly again, if you remember off the top of your head, was he arrested just for practicing his rights for fishing?
Yeah, when you think about, especially during the rush record, I think it was pretty close to 40 to 50 times. These individuals were being picked up for no reason, and especially when you knew, again, there's the picture, you knew who he was. There's the ponytail. There's the coat. It doesn't take much to just pull over and harass them and then pick them up and make sure that, because that's how that military works, right? That purpose, cut the head off the snake, the rest ain't gonna live and work. So they were going for the head key people of these battles that we were doing, of this situation, the ones. uh I think the big part is that, when I think about it too, is it's the canoe, it's the net, and it's the land. And Frank's Landing was that community center was that area where everybody came to because they knew that they weren't going to get harassed. They knew that they could put their canoe in the river and not have to look over their shoulder and make sure somebody wasn't going to come up and push them in or hit them with the stick or throw rocks at them. And there was a lot of rocks that came out of the bushes when these individuals, would go down. So I think it became more of a, a key to follow Billy and others that were key parts to this, and arrest them. Look, see, there he is, get him, but not even on the banks of the river, right? Because a lot of it, they knew that, these protests and these fishings were for a reason, right? I mean, even if they didn't have live salmon in their net, or even if they didn't have salmon in the net, they were how would you say it, proving their point, or making their point that it wasn't just about catching salmon, it was about exercising that right of putting the net in the river. That's what would really get Uncle going, is that that's part of that, right? um, and catching fish was a plus, we'd say, but exercising that right, which was important. And when you have a voice and you have somebody and you see it, you have to take them down in that community to slow them down or to stop that fight, right? you know so arrest them. That's all they could do. Arrest them. That's all they could do, to kill that spirit arrest them, put them into jail.
It's like waste their time until they
Yeah, no,
don't want to do it anymore.
well, the other thing that was really hard, they would confiscate the net, because then the net cost you money. So take the net, then they started taking our canoes, but then that became more. There had to be more evidence to take a canoe, but a net, because that's what was being put in the water. The net, I think, became pivotal, and I think that's why it's always important that Uncle would say that before the end, that we need to make sure our nets are being put in the water. That was part of that, exercising that right.
Didn't he say like take care of the nets too?
Right?
And then I was gonna ask, you yourself, you're a master weaver.
Mhm.
So do you know if anybody would weave nets back then because they were confiscating the nets like so much, or
I think prior to nets, it was more of the fishing wares and baskets. So we had these basket nets, or these baskets I always talk about,
Mhm.
that would carry salmon, or that would allow for the water to go through, but then the salmon couldn't get out, but the water and other things could rush through these webbings of a basket net. Not, I shouldn't say net, but a basket, because I think we had more bigger baskets than we had these longer nets. Netting, because to me, netting was more out in the ocean, what we'd say, or the sound, right? Here in the waterways of the Squaliash, tributaries from the Oha, Mayshell, other streams up there. That's where you would head off the salmon with your basket net. And Grandma Angeline is the one who taught my grandfather Don, of course, her son, how to knit, how to weave, um, how to cook, how to smoke fish. I think she was probably that staple in that corner too, that taught people, just unwillingly showed them this work. This is part of the work. This is part of the tradition, also, right? Feeding that what we catch, or processing that what we catch, especially around the salmon and other species out of the river there.
and then how did all of the fish wars start to kind of get resolved, and what was said, what was done, and then in the end what was the decision on why we have our rights now, and we're able to practice our right, still provide salmon to the people.
Well, through the trial, I always look at, and when you think about the '60s and then to '74, I mean, this little battle went on for a few years in the rivers of Nisqually, and then in the rivers of Puyallup, and when you think about these two areas, it was again the groups of village people that this is what we do, and having the group of men, and then continue the work with Uncle Billy and bringing in others and making sure that we're in the courts and you got the right attorneys and people are being brought in. I mean, that was part of that process, as fishermen, as gatherers, and what we need to do. And again, him laying out his net and catching the right ones. That's what I always say about that. He eventually went out there and laid his net out, and we have, again, certain width of net that we understood, that would then catch the king salmon, that would then catch the coho, that would then catch the chum, because each species is different. And we understood that, and that's how it is today. They see that today. Well, the king salmon is that what you call that flame. We'll call it a tomahawk steak king salmon. Coho, filet mignon wrapped with bacon. You can imagine that. Chum, I like ribeye. Not the bone-in ribeye. I like ribeye. Steelhead, that would be that what you think of that prime rib that you would get, off of that cow. When you think about this stuff, especially even a buffalo, that's how important these species are to different groups of people. And for me, damn it, I lost my train of thought. We were talking about fish wars, correct?
How it was getting wrapped up,
How it was
because
getting wrapped up, how
yeah.
how the process, and as they were going, and you know, and yeah, women, mothers. grandmothers, big part of this, aunties, because of that, them as they arrested all the men, that's who were next, um, to do this work, especially the fishing and exercising that right. Um, uh, so I always look back to 63. I think there was a little bit earlier than that too, like in 59 or 58. David's So Happy. 63 down on Frank's Landing. 70 in Puyallup. And then you had the Bolt decision in 74. So I think it was like 71 or 72 in Puyallup. And that process would be that we wanted to show, I guess, to me, what they're showing this not just here on Nisqually. This is over here in Puyallup, and this is over here in areas that we fished, and so they had to, again, the what Uncle and them all had to do was prove that we fished in these areas over these years during that, before that Bolt Judge Bolt ruled, or Judge Bolt gave his decision. And again, um, uh, I always looked at things as a choice, right? This is our choice. This is what we do. Things that are decided for us, kind of, to me, like rhyme with like homicide. They kill off all these possibilities for us of what it looks like to better our people too, not to be under the scrutiny of what we're told to do and how to do it and where to do it and when to do it. Um, but they didn't listen to our people during this Bolt decision kind of time. And the people telling them that there isn't a clock, there isn't a time. This is a season. This is a run. They come with that which feels from the river to the springs up above the rivers and things like that. But it all kind of boiled down to just the right of taking fish, our co-management, I would say, right? Because when you think about all that went into place with the fighting, and then where the salmon spawning, and the stuff that was unknown, created I think a bigger picture too of who's going to take care of this and who's going to take care of this now, because we're splitting something. uh, and I would hear Uncle say that, you know 50% of 50% of nothing is 50% of nothing. Is the glass half full or is it half empty?
Yeah.
And things like that. That when you look at what we got, yeah, it was a, you know, I guess one check, but it was more that we were looking for, right? And so, and that to me was the beginning. And I tell people that to me is where my uncle and my grandfather paid. When they paved this path for me, it makes it better for us to walk down. It gives us more pride to raise up and do more work around this, or be a part, right? Instead of throwing rocks at the glass house, and wondering when it's going to be over, because it'll never be over. This will never stop. We're always going to be under attack, under certain laws and under certain people, and how they feel about what we get and what we don't get. Because today, when I hear after the Bolt decision in '74, by 1990, I'm at the Yum High School as a sophomore, listening to people talk about how we got special rights, how we're special treated when it comes to fishing and other things, um, which I knew was totally wrong. But then, how do you educate people around that? Or at least show them a different lens to look through about what it is. Yeah, it being maybe the Bolt decision. I don't know how people are affected by that, but still, to me, it's the educating them about the treaty that pertains to the Bolt decision around the fish wars of who we are, because it's a um, great process to follow, right? I mean, and because I always come back to uh, the salmon and their process and what they have to go through. I think that's the teaching. It's a thing where they spend a lot of time in the circle of life being born. So spawn to die, I always say that's what salmon are. They come into this world, they live for 4 years, and they come back to the same spot just to give back to that area and die and give nutrients to that. So
And then, how did everybody get in contact with like Judge Bolt, or what made that, I guess, relationship or even conversation start with Judge Bolt?
Judge Bolt was a appointed federal judge. Um, you get these judges in these cases. Uh, we were hoping for a better judge, right? And this is who we got. You know, George H. Bolt. Uh, uh, he didn't favor any native cases prior to this one. I think he lied. I think he overturned two of them or something like that. But uh, like I said, the people when they fought, they knew that this is an opportunity. When they put us in front of the court system, it's not always well, always wasn't a friendly handshake in the court system. Yet we knew that this was bringing a lot of attention to this issue of fishing or exercising our treaty right or whatever, whichever one it was. I know that there was a lot of argument around that. But knowing that what we spoke and what we did and how we did it was the truth. We weren't making stuff up. We weren't trying to be evil and try to make up these lies and tell a different story about our people. And when you bring in these traditional people at that time who only spoke the language and other aspects of it, it was nice that they could see that interaction. And this case I think opened up a lot of other native cases across the states here. When you think about um, treaty rights under attack and what we got, and when I look at it and I hear about this Bolt decision, is what comes to mind is co-management. And when I hear other stories from other states um, that don't have co-management, because co-management became a word over here in the state of Washington that nobody wants to use in South Dakota, Minnesota, Montana. You know, I heard a story from Minnesota. They banned the word co-management back in the '70s when they started talking about it and how it would affect you know budget, funding, and people. Really, I think that's what really got into play here around this decision and seeing it at the time, or at least reading it into the papers. What I see, it was very controversial. Man, there was a lot that people's lives were at stake at that point. Thinking about what was at risk. And to me, what they did, especially fighting and getting arrested and getting beat, and continuing to getting beat. I think those were worse than going to jail, right? What they did on the other end of trying to really divert us from continuing this work. These individuals, especially in high places, know that if you get to the kids, they won't do this stuff, right? Especially if it's not trained or if it's not teached that way, right? And so, um, yeah, my father and his my father Don Jr. when he tells me his stories of that, not only fishing but what came after that, boarding schools and other things, because now, before the fish wars, they were already putting kids in boarding schools, and parents were then sending their kids to these boarding schools because that's what they thought they had to do. That's what they were programming us to do. You know, which we didn't want to. That was not of us, and um, I look at that first part of the fish wars for them, the trauma. Now, you know, third generation myself, the trauma's still there when you talk about it. That's why nobody really talks about it in a way like this. It's because it brings up that what they don't want to think about or what had happened at the time. So,
And then so with today, how Nisqually is now, and where everything has gone, leading up to this day, um, you know, Billy Frank Jr. is getting a statue in Statuary Hall for people who don't know. Billy Frank's getting a boat named after him. What are your thoughts on the now? I guess I should say.
well, the now, I mean, it is a statue that you have these key figures, or you have, I mean, there's statues all over the place of individuals that people look up, not up to, but look at like, oh, we know that. Oh, yeah, they did this, or so for this area, especially in the Northwest, and then this little tiny little village over here called Nisqually, to have this individual honored is like, wow, boom. It's like, what would he say? Or when I hear it come from his son, this is the center of the universe, right? And these are times now that we need these key figures or these things to look up for us as Native people. And when you look at that statue, or even that vessel that has his name on it, it's a proud moment for a lot of native people who understand the fight, who understand the struggle, right? And then who, when you look to the future, because the future is unknown. um, the past is very, the past when I look at it, and today's, for me, the present. It is a present to be here today, from uh, uh, working, having a house here in the res, to being a fisherman, to being a diver out there. What they did, and I said that before. Like, when they paved the path, now it's a uh, a way of walking. Because I always say it's how we get up, because we fall a lot, but it's how you get up from that fall. If it's today, or if it's next week when we fall down. And it's good to, when we get up, I always say that, what's there to look forward to, and we don't have a lot of that, especially in Indian country. And when you do, we need more of it. That signifies that. And these statues that uncles get named, and this boat signifies more of that in not only Indian country, but what we call here Turtle Island that we're on. You know, because we're all, I say, on the same backs of the same turtle. So I don't know why it needs to be any different than it is. And the future for that is um, uh, that fight for the salmon. Then that's what you would see. Well, Billy, the ship that goes out there to do its work. It always, that note, or that sound will always ring. For that. Because that's what he stood for: the salmon, the water, the habitat. So uh, it's gonna mean more so. Like I say, like I'm a third generation from that, for the fish war. A ninth generation, or eighth generation, somewhere in there, from the signing of the treaty. And Lushai would say that this is a time for us to celebrate. And his saying is, teach your children, and then teach their children of a great people, because there will be a time where I will be there, or celebrating with you in spirit. And that's what we got to look forward to. That's, as Native people, when we look forward to this stuff, this work here on Earth, it goes further than that for us spiritually, right? So then we get to look forward to that. And these symbols, and the statues, one of them, because we had welcome figures in our villages, and then they cut them down. We had beautiful longhouses in here, and they cut them up for their farms. When they moved into these areas. So each territory, in each area, especially here in this beautiful Northwest, has a great story to tell. And that's what you'll see when you see this statue, that beautiful story of the beautiful great Northwest.
Perfectly said. And then I just realized, I don't know why I didn't really think of this earlier, but with the whole, naming of the boat, Billy Frank Jr., after him, he's just going to be on that water again like he used to always
Yeah,
be. So,
yeah.
but
Just
yeah, that wraps up today's podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed, and please let us know, what you think about the whole podcast, what you learned. Even tell your own story, in the comments. That's one thing that Billy Frank Jr. always said: tell your story. Let your story be heard. And so we want to wrap up today. And I thank you for sitting down, taking your time out of your day to watch, and subscribe, like, helps us a lot. Give us feedback, and tell us what we can do better. We're always open ears about how we can improve. Each day we improve, each day, each episode we get better. So yeah, I appreciate you guys once again, and thank you.